Welcome everybody to the webinar on media production in the field. This is the second part of the science communication seminars in the frame of the Arctic Passion online seminar series. Welcome again to those of you who already attended on Tuesday in the webinar on storytelling and science, and those of you who watched the recording afterwards. For those who just attend today and did not see the recording or the live seminar on Tuesday, I would recommend to watch the first one after this one, because this one builds on the contents from the first one. But anyways, welcome to all of you. Today we will learn about how we can gather media in the field, and this while doing actual research. So we'll cover how you can identify your story's needs and how you can put together, for example, a production plan. And our speaker will also give you some basic insights into photography and videography. Shortly about myself, I'm Lisa Großfeld, and I'm a project officer at the APEX office at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Germany. And APEX means the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. And with this association, we are responsible for the education and training activities in the Arctic Passion Project. With us today as well is my close colleague, Sabrina Herima from Gret Arendal. And she's also strongly involved in the Arctic Passion Project, and they're working in the project communication. Again, a warm welcome also to Olivia Rempiel. She is also working at Gret Arendal, and she's there a documentary filmmaker and multimedia journalist. And her tasks are producing, shooting, and editing documentaries, as well as she also teaches a mini course at the Technical University of Denmark on science communication. So thank you again, Olivia, for having you here today. Just for you who did not hear about the Arctic Passion Project yet, this is a 4-year EU-funded project, and it aims at creating a coherent, integrated observing system in the Arctic to monitor environmental changes there. It really focuses on co-creation of knowledge and is cooperating with local and indigenous communities. In this seminar, this is part of a series from Arctic Passion, and we aim to inflate a more inclusive and proactive dialogue with people from different groups, backgrounds, and career levels, and want to share experiences and results and also the progress of the project here. Just some technical things before we soon get started. So please note that this webinar will be recorded and will be made available on the APEX Vimeo channel and the Arctic Passion YouTube channel. If you have any questions during the talk or after the talk, you can raise them in the chat. I think this is preferred because then we can start a conversation there, but you can also post them in the Q&A box. Sabrina will monitor the chat and will take the questions after the talk. So we'll have a short discussion round there, and your questions will be answered there. So, and now let's not wait any longer. I think we'll get started. Olivia, please, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello everyone, welcome back for those of you who joined part 1. So in the past, I've presented this content in 3 different parts, but you lucky folks get the extremely condensed version. So today's goal is to prepare you with the basic skills to take nice photos, record usable audio, prepare for interviews, and take good videos. And then we're going to bring it all together and talk about how you figure out what to focus on and some strategies for fitting media production into your fieldwork. So let's get started. So you want to take good photos. So everyone always asks me to advise them which camera to get. but I have a really hard time making suggestions because it's just so individualized. But what I can advise is, if you're just starting to get into photography, is to use what you've got. So please don't go out and buy a new camera. It's best to get comfortable with what you have, focus on learning good composition. And then once you hit your device's limitations and you want to go beyond, that's when you decide what to buy. But that being said, people will still ask the question. So I'm going to give you a broad overview of the camera options. By the way, there are also GoPros and mirrorless cameras, but GoPros have more niche uses, and mirrorless cameras, they'll kind of fall under the DSLRs in this comparison a little bit, but they're also smaller, which is a big pro. So for the pros, if your main requirement is you need the camera to be convenient and accessible, if you use your smartphone or a small point and shoot camera, then they will always win out in size and portability. They are cheaper, they often have great auto settings, and the images don't require a lot of processing afterwards, so the convenience factor is unparalleled. But where the DSLR or mirrorless cameras win out is you have so many more settings and the option to change your lenses. And although DSLR photos may require more processing, they look absolutely amazing once you're done. And the format is also bigger. So if you plan to enlarge your photos, maybe like for a poster session or something like that, DSLRs will be a much better option. One important con to consider if you're going to be using your smartphone for photos is battery life, because you also need to use your phone for other things beside photos. So it can really drain your battery quite quickly, but this is easily fixed by having an external charger available. Otherwise, the cons of the point and shoot and the smartphone are basically challenges in dark situations, or if you're trying to take more specialized photos like macro photos of very small things, or if you need to zoom a lot to capture things that are far away, then there are going to be some cons for the smartphone and the point and shoot. So the DSLR generally has more flexibility in these kinds of situations. And then the major con of the DSLR, which people don't often think about, is the settings can just be way too overwhelming. And if you're not into photography, or if you're not very comfortable with it yet, it's too much too soon. And also they're very heavy and bulky, so it can be kind of a pain to carry around. And if you won't carry your camera with you because of the extra weight, and therefore you can't use it, it kind of defeats the purpose of having it in the first place. So it's kind of important to think about. Now let's move on to composition. If you're an absolute beginner photographer and you only take one thing away from this entire presentation, let it be the rule of thirds. So this will help you take well-balanced photos. And how it works is you want to divide the width and the length of your photo into thirds with a grid like this. And by lining up the horizon and main elements of your photo with the 4 lines, it brings balance to your photo and makes it more pleasing to the eye. So you can see in this photo that the water line of the island is lined up with the lower horizontal line, and that the lighthouse is lined up with the right vertical line. And that's how this particular photo follows the rule of thirds. And keep in mind, not every photo works well with the rule of thirds, so you'll often be breaking it. But especially when you're taking landscape photos, it can be a really great guideline. Now, I want to show you this same photo cropped so that it doesn't follow the rule of thirds. So you can see why this composition looks really nice and balanced. So here it is. So one important one to pay attention to is the middle one, because yes, the lighthouse is the main point of interest in this photo, but oftentimes putting the focal point dead center, especially in landscape shots, is going to look not quite as good. So take a look with the grid in place. You can see that the horizon and the water line aren't lining up with any of the lines in the middle and left and center photos. You can also see that there's way too much sky in the middle photo, And on the left side, the lighthouse is way in the upper right corner. The photo in the middle and on the left aren't following the rule of thirds, and the one on the right is. Again, I'm just going to show you the photos without the grid so you can kind of see the difference. Now we need to talk about the rule of thirds and looking space. So when you're lining up your subject with one of the vertical lines, you want to make sure that the direction they're looking in is the direction that has more space if your subject is a person. When your main subject is a person or an animal, you may also want to line up their eye line with the top horizontal line. This is the way that you follow the rule of thirds with portraits. So now I'm sure you all want to start using the rule of thirds in your photography right away. So I'm going to show you how to enable the grid if you're an iPhone user, so that you can actually see how you're following the rule of thirds. So you'll want to go into your settings, then camera, and then you can turn on the grid. And as you can, and this will add a faint line to your camera's viewfinder so that when you're taking photos or videos, you can see, so you can kind of follow the rule of thirds a bit easier. I'm going to share a few tips and tricks for iPhone users because that's what I use. So I apologize for the non-iPhone users, but hopefully your smartphones will have similar functionalities. So I'd recommend just kind of Googling the equivalency and hopefully there's something similar for Android and other phones. So it should go without saying, but I just want to reiterate that it's important. So it's important to keep your horizon straight in your photos, unless you have an intentional kind of artsy reason for it. But when you're following the rule of thirds, it should be pretty easy to do since you'll hopefully be lining up your horizon with one of the horizontal lines on your grid. Next up, we're going to talk about zoom. So not all zoom functions are created equal. There are two different kinds. You have optical and digital zoom. And optical zoom is the one you want because optical zoom is where the lens glass actually moves further from the sensor, which creates the magnifying effect. Digital zoom, on the other hand, is literally just cropping closer in on an image and magnifying the pixels. So digital zoom reduces the quality and makes the photo a bit more grainy. It's usually just point and shoot cameras that include digital zoom. So just Google the model of point and shoot camera you have, if you do have one. And if your camera uses digital zoom, then I would suggest just maybe turning it off, and you can always crop your photos in later. So first confirm whether you have optical or digital zoom. And then if you have digital zoom, my recommendation is to zoom with your feet. So literally just walk closer when you want to get closer, if you can. But optical zoom does something other than just get you closer to what you're taking a photo of. It also impacts the perceived distance between objects. So, you know, when you see those shots of crowded streets in maybe a documentary, and, you know, if you're from a Nordic country, you probably think to yourself, seriously, like, is this how like people in New York or like the densely populated world live? Like, I promise you, most of the time, it's just a trick of the camera. So here you have some photos taken by Jeff Cutler, who did a great experiment with different focal lengths on a beach in Vancouver during the early days of the pandemic. So there were some misleading photos printed in newspapers that made it look like people were crowding the beaches and not distancing. But as you can see from this series, people were properly distancing, but photographers were taking photos using optical zoom that made it look like people were really crammed together. So you can see from the photo taken with the 200mm zoom that the space between the people looks pretty minimal. Then at 70 and 35mm, the space is looking much more reasonable. And then when you see a drone image, you see the real distance between people. But at a closer range, focal length can even change how squished or stretched out your facial features look. Have you ever looked at a selfie or another photo of your face and not recognized yourself? So this is focal length at work because, but just keep in mind that the most natural focal length for portraits is between 30 and 50 millimeters. But yeah, sometimes it's not Photoshop, it's not Facetune, it's literally just focal length making people's faces look different. Speaking of which, let's talk a bit about portraits. Sometimes when you're taking a portrait, you want to show a person with sharp details around them. Maybe they're standing among their research equipment, or maybe there's beautiful scenery around them that adds to the story. But other times you want to take portraits where the focus is just on the subject, or maybe a close-up of an object or an animal. And basically you want to blur out everything else and just focus on one person or one thing. So the camera control that allows you to do that is called aperture, or f-stop. And if you're an iPhone user, you can change your f-stop and add in or remove background blur when you're taking photos in portrait mode. But did you know that you can actually do that after you've taken the photo? So here's a screen recording that shows you how. You just open your photo library, tap on edit in the top right corner, and then tap on the F at the top left side, and then slide to change from just a little bit of blur to a lot of blur. One more secret to taking interesting and dynamic photos is to take photos that show movement. But the key here is to have some things in focus while other things are blurry. Otherwise, it's just a blurry photo. So it's important to take your photos with intention. Now, for those of you who have DSLR cameras with all the manual functions, taking photos like this, often called long exposure photos, requires having a slower shutter speed and either a super steady hand or preferably a tripod to keep the camera steady. But there's a hack for how to do this with your iPhone. Similarly to the portrait mode, the long exposure feature can be added after you take the photo. But it's only possible if the live photo feature is turned on. So you can see where that is located in the corner of the camera app. If you ever took photos when you first got your iPhone and saw that the photos moved a bit, like in Harry Potter newspapers, and you're maybe like creeped out by it, you probably just turned it off immediately. And that makes sense because live photos, they do take up more space than non-live photos. But if you want to add movement into your photos, you will definitely want to turn it on. So after you turn live on, you want to take a photo in which the camera itself is super steady. So maybe you want to lean it against something or use a tripod or just like really hold your breath while you're taking your photo. And then you want to make sure that something in the photo is moving. So whether that's the tide or a waterfall or traffic or a bunch of people, then once you've taken your photo, you open it in the photo library and you go to the live menu in the top left-hand corner of the photo and select long exposure. You can see in this little video. And then it will convert your photo into a long exposure shot. But if you don't like it and it looks better before, you can always just turn it back. So now I want to talk about some more tips and recommendations on how to improve your photography composition that don't require any money for fancy gear. So one tip is to simplify your photos. That way your viewer isn't overwhelmed by too many distractions and you have minimal composition with one subject. We also have a tendency to try to have no humans in our landscape shots. And I agree with you, sometimes it's nice to have a landscape shot with no people. And if you're at an overly touristic site, it often looks like a little bit tacky to have a big swarm of people. Maybe unless you're trying to make a point about the ecological harm of unsustainable tourism. But often having just one or two humans well placed in a landscape shot can add scale to the shot and it makes it more interesting. So that, that's why all the Instagram hiker girls do really well. So it's important to think like a minimalist, especially when there's something awkward, just out of frame that's kind of jutting in and distracting you. You want to change your framing to keep those distractions out whenever possible. But sometimes you can fix it afterwards with a bit of cropping. So one thing you'll notice about this photo is the greenery in front of the skyscrapers. In addition to creating a contrast that makes this photo interesting, the man-made world kind of contrasted with the natural world, it also creates a sense of depth by having something in the foreground and something in the background. So this idea of layering your photos, having something in the foreground, maybe it's something that's out of focus, and so you can just kind of see it like the blur, and then having a middle layer to your photo and then something in the background, it's going to really make your images pop as people like kind of look at the different layers of interest. Another way to create depth is, in a sense, to frame your photos, whether that's an almost literal frame like a window frame, or leaves or branches or clouds or mist in the corners or on the sides of your photo. This is also, in a sense, leading your viewer's eye into the photo. And another way to do that is by using leading lines. Now, sometimes leading lines can be really direct and literal. So in this case, you have a literal path leading the viewer's eye into the middle of the photo. But sometimes leading lines can be less obvious, like in this photo where you have the tracks in the dirt that are leading your eye into the center. And then you also have the shadow lines leading you in from the right side. So playing with light is very fun in photography. But it's important to know when to avoid backlighting and when to use it to your advantage in an artistic way. So you have to think about one thing: where is your light source coming from? Backlighting happens when your light source is which is usually the sun, but sometimes a lamp or a computer screen, etc., is behind your subject. Because if your subject is between you and your light source, it can cause backlighting where you don't see the subject's features at all. Now, this can be done artfully and on purpose, but it can also just be a mistake. So you need to know the difference. Is there a creative reason for the features of the person to be completely dark? It's really important that you do this with intention, have a vision, and then execute the vision. Think about what you want to say with your photo or your video or whatever media you're creating. Now, one big indicator of whether your backlighting is going to look cool and dramatic versus accidental is the time of day, because usually your dramatic, purposefully backlit shots are taken during golden hour, which is the hour after sunrise and the hour before sunset. So when the light is really low, it can create really beautiful lens flare and silhouettes. But if you're taking your photo at noon when the sun is high in the sky, and then you put your subject between the sun and the camera, maybe you're standing in the shadow of your subject, that's when it usually looks more like a mistake. So here you can see some photos that were taken in the middle of the day where the person got between the camera and the sun. And here you can see some purposefully backlit photos, which were both taken at sunrise and sunset. And in both cases, the subject is in a shadow, but it's very purposeful. And you can see a bit of lens flare as well. Now, this is some universally good advice. Don't awkwardly cut off anyone's limbs. So of course, taking a portrait from the shoulders up, for example, is intentional, or a close-up of the hands or something. But what you want to avoid is like awkwardly chopping off an arm, that if someone is gesturing, or cropping so close that the top of their head is cut off. So those kinds of things. Give them some breathing room or some headroom, and be mindful of an awkward cut. Okay, now if there's just two things that you take away from the photography section, let it be the rule of thirds and this. This being, you want to have coverage. Make sure you take a variety of photos of any given situation. So we're all a little bit guilty of this. So I'm sure you have a friend who loves taking landscape shots and all their vacation photos are just nice landscapes. And you're like, okay, who were you even with? Like, what did you do? And then you have another friend who loves taking people photos And so they'll share photos from their vacation with just like all their friends' faces. And then they're like, oh, we were at this beautiful spot. And but I forgot to take a photo of it. So there's an easy solution to this, which aside from making those friends team up, would be to think of the shots you might need to give an overview of a place. What are you doing? And make sure you get a really good mix. So for example, do you have a wide landscape shot that shows the nature of the place? Do you have a landscape shot with a few humans in it? Do you have a medium shot of people taking samples if you're out doing field work? Then some close-ups of hands at work, of maybe a few still life photos of different items that are essential to the work. Perhaps a few pose portraits of researchers. You want to think if whether you gave this series of photos to someone who's never been to that place, like will they kind of get a feel for it? Now, before we move on to the audio section, I need to talk about writing good captions. So you want them to be short but descriptive. You want to add the date the photo was taken, and you definitely want to add the location, names of any people who appear in the photo, credit the photographer, maybe a descriptive detail or two that gives a context as to why you took the photo, and perhaps any species names. So this one time I joined a research expedition with a bunch of ornithologists. And before I left the field station, I just made sure to sit down with one of them and identify all the birds that I'd taken photos of, because it would have been an absolute nightmare for me to just do that alone. So if you're sending photos to journalists, think about them and include captions with any species names and all these relevant details, so they don't have to get back in touch and be asking or just trying to figure it out themselves. Okay, so now we're moving on to audio. So there are a lot of cases when you want to make sure you have good audio. Maybe you want to start a podcast. Maybe you expect to be doing a lot of remote interviews that might be played on other people's podcasts or on the radio. Maybe you're recording videos or voiceovers for videos. In any of these cases, it's really important to sound good. In videos, it's actually more important to have high quality sound than high quality footage in a lot of cases. So I'm going to talk about some different ways you can improve your sound. So first, you need to think about gear. If you were planning to start your own podcast, or perhaps doing some social science research that requires you to do interviews and gather qualitative data, you might have the need or the budget to buy professional audio recording gear. But you don't need to break the bank to just step up your audio game. So while a professional setup can cost quite a bit, you can invest a really small amount and it'll bring recording on your phone to the next level. So you can do a lot of things just using your phone. Of course, you can just use voice memos on your iPhone or voice recorder on Android. But one small step that already helps is if you download an audio recording app. So there's Meta Recorder, Anchor, Recording Studio Lite, so probably others as well. And if you're planning to record interviews regularly or record videos with your phone, you can spend less than 100 euros and get an external microphone that plugs right into your phone, and it will bring your audio to the next level. So you can get one that plugs into the headphone jack, or for iPhone users, you can either get an adapter or find a microphone that's made for iPhone. And to me, this is a relatively small investment that has a really high payoff. To have good audio is just really steps up your professionalism. So if you're planning to film videos or do a lot of remotely recorded interviews, this is something I would recommend. Most of the audio recording apps you have to choose from will have these markers. And so this is a great thing to be aware of and use. So if you're interviewing someone else, or if you're doing multiple takes of a voiceover, it's good to have this function so that you can mark really good takes as they're being recorded, and great quotes so that you can find them later much easier. But no matter what you're using to record, it's important to know a little bit about how you can record something usable. So you need to pay attention to audio levels. So a lot of these things might seem a little bit obvious, but I just need to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So let's say you start recording something and you look at the audio bars and they barely move. So what do you think is going to happen when you try to play back that audio later? So it's going to sound incredibly quiet. And in order to actually hear it, you have to raise the volume really high afterwards. And that's going to amplify any background noises, any fuzz that you don't want to do. So the next issue is you record some audio and it's just going totally off the charts. So this is the opposite issue. It's what we call peaking, and it's where the voice gets cut off and becomes distorted. So you want to avoid this as well. So when you start recording something, in addition to wearing headphones and listening to whether it sounds nice, you also want to keep an eye on the audio levels and make sure they're not recording too high or too low. And if you notice a problem and you have a fancy recorder, you can change the sensitivity of the microphone. But another thing that's going to impact your audio levels is your distance from the microphone. So different mics all have different sounds and different levels of sensitivity, but there are a few rules to keep in mind when you're talking into a microphone. And a big one is the distance from the mic. So you can see in the example photo that it's good to aim for around the distance between your thumb and your pinky finger. The reason you don't want to get too close to the mic is because then the recording will pick up all sorts of gross mouth sounds that no one wants to hear. And if you swallow, it'll hear that too. So these are all things you want to avoid. But if you get too far away from the mic, you'll sound distant, and that's not good either. So be mindful of where you are in relation to the microphone. Now, have you ever listened to a piece of media and heard just an awful echo? One of the most impactful things you can do when you're recording a piece of audio to get good sound, and if you're not going to also be on camera, is to surround yourself with soft things, because sound tends to bounce around on hard surfaces and it creates echoes and it just sounds really bad. So the easiest thing you can do is make an epic blanket fort. But you have to be careful, make sure that it's a structurally sound blanket fort, because you don't want blankets brushing against the microphone or the whole thing to just collapse mid-interview. These are all problems. And you might think I'm joking, but I'm dead serious. Like, this is a real thing. You will actually see audio journalists who are out in the field, like really serious reporters. And if they're on deadline and they have to record something and they can't go into a studio, they will hide under a blanket. It's really funny to see. And also closets are another great place to record audio. So that's actually where a lot of professional podcasters were recording from at the beginning of the pandemic. And there's a good reason, because there's a lot of soft things in closets. There's also a lot of noise we tend to just automatically tune out in our daily lives, but that can be really noticeable on an audio recording. So some things to consider: can you hear traffic from where you're at? Can you get further away from the traffic? Is there an AC or a heating unit that is making noise now, or could it kick in mid recording session and make noise then? Is there a refrigerator that's making a lot of noise? So you might want to turn all these things off while you're recording, but in particular for the refrigerator, don't forget to turn it back on afterwards. That I've made that mistake before. And actually a little tip is to put your car keys inside the refrigerator so that you will for sure remember to turn it back on. Pets can also be a challenge. So try to put them in another room. And then, of course, put your phone on silent. Now, one more thing you want to do if you're recording audio as a voiceover for a video, when you're going to record audio, you want to record about 10 seconds of what we call room tone. So basically, you just stay quiet for about 10 seconds while the recorder captures the sounds of the room. So this is extremely useful for when you're editing and you want to smooth out harsh cuts. Most of you will probably not be interviewing someone, but I'm going to go over interviewing tips just in case any of you decide to start a podcast or decide to do a practice interview with a friend or a colleague. And it's also just useful to kind of have an idea and know how interviewers prepare. So first of all, you want to write your questions in advance, read up on who you're talking to, find out about their research and their background, make sure you know how to spell their name, all that good stuff. And then, despite the fact that you've just read up on this person and probably know a little bit about their research, you still need to ask those dumb questions. And they're not actually dumb. They're just what an average person would want to know. Sometimes interviewers will craft a question that could be a little bit self-serving. And you can kind of tell that the main point of the question is to show off how much research they did. But avoid doing that unless your audience is other experts. Ask the questions that the general public would want to know. Ask open-ended questions. If you ask a yes or no question, chances are you'll get a yes or no answer, and there's not very far you can go from there. But funny enough, it's actually the opposite with politicians. If you're interviewing a politician, you actually just want to ask yes or no questions. Ask for clarification. If you don't understand something, your audience will likely have the same issue. So don't be shy to ask for clarification, even multiple times if needed. If you think you understood something, but you're not sure, repeat what they said back to them in your own words and make sure that you understand, or rephrase it in a simpler way to make sure it's correct. Ask some touchy-feely questions. How do they feel about something? Why do they care about their research? We want to bring out their passion here. Ask big picture questions. How will this impact the daily lives of regular people? What's the global significance? What body of research is this supporting? Ask about future work. What's next for them? If funding was no issue, what would they study next? What do they hope will change in response to this new finding? And at the very end of the interview, ask if there's anything else you've missed that they want to talk about. Give them space to bring up anything that's on their minds that they would that they want the world to know. You might need to get clarification later, so ask if you can get in touch. Order your questions in a way that makes sense and builds upon each other. Start with some more soft questions. Where are you from? How did you get involved in your field? And save the harder questions like, what do you say to your critics, for the very end? But also, don't be afraid of silence. If you're constantly jumping in to fill uncomfortable silence, you might miss something they were building up to say. Sometimes it's nice to keep a more casual flow of conversation going, but other times just let there be silence. So moving on, when you're the one being interviewed, a lot of the same advice applies. Don't worry about sounding smart. It's more important if your audience understands you than sounding smart. Don't use jargon or explain it if you have to. A great way to practice simplifying things and avoiding jargon is to call your grandparents and explain your research to them. Or if there's a kid in your life, try explaining to them. That's also very helpful. Be concise. My advice is to practice this, practice explaining your research a few times back to back. Because the second or third time you explain it, you'll likely focus more on the more essential details, which if you're an interviewer, sometimes if you don't get a good explanation the first time, ask, or if it's too long, you can come back to the same question later in the interview, and sometimes you'll get a more concise answer. You may also want to be a bit descriptive. And I know that this seems contradictory from the previous advice to be concise. But what I mean by be descriptive is maybe you want to describe your environment a little bit, give your more concise answer to the technical question, but then also describe the environment a little bit, think about the senses, help the person that you're talking to get a feel for what you're describing. It can also be helpful to explain things in more than one way. Maybe it makes sense to give a longer explanation and then just quickly sum up what you said and make sure you've been well understood. Think about the sound bites. Sound bites are those really good quotes. Maybe they explain something really well, or it's a really good analogy, which is why it's great to actually think of some analogies in advance of the interview. Test them out on your friends who are in a different field, make sure that they make sense, or just find some available grandparents again, or kids. If you don't have kids of your own, find some kids to explain it to. But also, please, no sports analogies. Think of us poor folks who don't follow sports. So if you're being interviewed on camera for a video, if it's one of those programs where they won't be including the interview asking the question in the video, they love it when you build the question into your answer. So let me give an example. Let's say the interviewer asks you, how did you feel when you first arrived at the field site? And you respond, I was kind of exhausted, but also very excited. It's actually better if you respond, when I arrived at the field site, I was kind of exhausted, but also very excited. So you see what I mean? Make sure that the quote can actually just stand alone and it doesn't require the previous question to make it make sense. The next tip is share an anecdote. We all love a good anecdote. This is how you get like sort of the human interest element into your story. This is how you win over people who are skeptical of science, because it can humanize the researchers. So if you share an anecdote or something funny or challenging or heartwarming that's related to your research or something that happened during your field work, it's going to make the hard data more accessible. If you're worried that something might be misconstrued, point it out. For the most part, journalists are good people and they don't intentionally try to make mistakes, but sometimes it happens. They oversimplify things. I've had it happen before where an overly zealous editor went in and added mistakes into my writing because they're just trying to further simplify things. And, you know, people are on deadline, people are human. Sometimes you don't catch it. So if you think something has the potential to be misconstrued, point it out to them and just confirm that they understood. So if they're a good journalist, they will appreciate it and they won't get offended. But if a journalist asks you a question that you don't know the answer to, remember that you don't have to say anything. If you feel uncomfortable speaking on a subject, you can nicely explain that you can't comment on that and you don't have to take that question. Now, sometimes scientists do that a bit too much. So if you're a super specialized person and you refuse to answer questions that are just even a little bit outside of your niche, maybe just try and be a bit reasonable here. Or maybe if you really just don't want to talk about something, if you're not comfortable, maybe you can refer the journalist to someone who you think might be able to speak better to that subject matter. And finally, you should know the term off the record and on background. So I know this is a less common issue in your field, but if you're ever in a situation where you want to talk to a journalist about something important, but there's an important reason that you don't want your name attached to that information, there are ways to do that and protect your identity. So I want to be clear, you should only do this in a genuine situation where you're a whistleblower, because people who try to get anonymity for kind of silly reasons, it's just not a good look. But if you're in a genuinely concerning situation, if you want to be an anonymous source, that needs to be discussed with the journalist and agreed on before the interview. And when you want to say something that's perhaps relevant for the journalist to know, but you don't want it to be published, then you can tell them that this is off the record before sharing that piece of information, and then they won't publish it. On the other hand, if there's a detail that can be published, but you just don't want it linked to you, you can say it's on background. And in that case, it usually means that the journalist will use that tip and go find another source who's willing to go on the record with that piece of information. unless using anonymous sources, using anonymous sources, in most cases, it looks kind of bad. So journalists prefer to use named sources whenever they can. So I really hope none of you are ever in this situation, but it's still just to be aware of some of the terminology here. Okay, so I hope that wasn't too much. So now we're going to focus on videos. So as a researcher, you might be wondering, why would I want to spend time to take videos? In what circumstances might this skill be important? So one possibility is maybe you and your research will be featured on a TV news story or perhaps a documentary. And since you can't have a video crew following you at all times, at least probably not, it's very likely that key moments in your research will happen either before the camera crew shows up or after they've left. And in those cases, having what we call archival footage really adds to the film. So I mentioned this in part 1, but it bears repeating. So any key moment in your research that only happens once, if there's a moment of discovery, if someone is prepared to catch it on video, this is priceless footage, and it will be useful in any media that ends up being produced about your research. And the second and more involved case in which videography skills are useful is maybe you're really keen to share your work with the world and you want to start making your own videos. And the reason you might want to do that are to get your research out into the world, maybe to help secure funding. So I've heard that video grant proposals are becoming a thing. So these are some things to keep in mind. And actually, if anyone who's listening has done a video grant proposal, let us know in the comments, because I'm really curious about how that went. But in both cases, you want to be prepared. So if you're someone who isn't planning on making your own videos and you just want to be prepared for media coverage, you don't have to dedicate a ton of time. You just need to get some key shots. So you need to think about the big picture of your research project. What are the key turning points? And if you expect that there's going to be a moment of discovery, then you want to be ready to document if that happens. But I know a lot of research is very repetitive and you have a process. And the best idea is to take the time to document the key steps in your research with both photos and videos. So get a video when you take the sample, when you label the sample, when you store it, these kinds of things, these things that are repeated hundreds of times. You just need one good shot of each step, and it shouldn't take too long. Make sure you get some good shots of the environment if you're out doing field work. You want to show where you are. Or if you're in the lab, get a nice wide shot of the space that you're in. And make sure some people in your group, so they might be camera shy, but make sure you get shots of the people who you work with, because people want to see other people. And focus on quality over quantity. So when you're dedicating some time to this, just take a step back and think about the composition of the images and videos, and don't rush yourself. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, but just try to focus and not be too distracted. I know field work can last for weeks or even months. If you just dedicate an hour or two to videos and photos spread out over those weeks, I promise you'll be happy you did. And you'll be way ahead of most people in terms of communicating your work. Maybe film for 10-minute blocks every 3 days. Make a schedule that works for you and your team. And for those of you who do want to edit your own videos and share them on social media, perhaps you need to be prepared to capture like the exact same shots, just more of them. And maybe you want to film yourself explaining some things too. But you can also do that later as a voiceover. So now that you know what kind of content you need to shoot, we're going to move on to how to get these shots. So same for the photography cameras. People ask me all the time, what kind of camera should I use for video? And again, it really just depends on your needs and your budget. So it's really hard to make any recommendations without knowing a lot of details, but people are going to ask it anyways. So first option is you can use your smartphone, but you also want to use an additional audio accessory. So this is one of the most accessible options for someone who already has a good smartphone and wants to get into video. You can also shoot with a DSLR or mirrorless camera. And this might, that's one that you would also be using for photos. So this, you can also add an audio accessory to. And this is an option that I would recommend if you're already into photography and you already have this nice camera for photos. So if you're already a photographer and you want to get into video, just use your DSLR. And another option is the DJI Pocket or the GoPro with an external audio. So this is a good option if you're not particularly interested in photography, but you want something really small that's just there and ready. And it would also, I would lean towards the GoPro if you study anything underwater and you want to get underwater video as well, because GoPros are really great for that. Also, one note, if your camera is all set up for photography, you might be using a really cheap SD card, which is totally fine for photography, but you'll want to check if it's fast enough for video. So I believe 30 megabytes per second is the minimum to shoot video. But if your camera is suddenly having issues when you're trying to shoot video for the first time, check your SD card. Now, you will notice that I mentioned additional audio accessories for most of these cameras, and there's a very good reason for that, which I mentioned earlier. So it might seem odd, but yes, you actually want to focus more on sound, because when you're watching a video with good audio, you don't think about the audio. But if you're watching a video with bad audio, you immediately notice it. And your first reflex is to stop watching because it sounds unprofessional. But contrast that with video. People are much more willing to accept poor quality video than poor quality audio. In fact, a lot of renowned documentaries were made using old archival footage that isn't very high quality, but when you combine it with professional audio and amazing storytelling, you've got a great story. So that's why I don't recommend going out and buying the fanciest camera if it's going to be something that you just do on the side. But if you can spare it, I would recommend spending that 50 to 100 euros to get a little external microphone for your camera or your phone so that you can shoot good video with higher quality sound, because internal microphones almost always really suck. So now you're going to come across a lot of different kinds of microphones, and there are different kinds of microphones with different purposes. So you have the lapel mics and the lavalier mics. And these can be either wired or plugged into your recorder, or they can be wireless. And then you have what's called shotgun mics. And so which one of these you get is going to depend on the kind of shooting you want to do. So lavaliers are for interviews, so capturing people's voices, and then shotgun mics just pick up as much sound as possible in whatever direction you aim it. So if you expect to be interviewing a lot of people or talking directly to the camera yourself or doing a voiceover later, maybe the lavalier mic is going to be a better option for you. But if you're trying to capture audio in the environment or multiple people talking to each other and you just want to be a little bit more reactive, it's probably easier to stick with a shotgun mic. Now, same with what we talked about in the photography section. You want to get a couple of different kinds of video shots. So when you're shooting something, sometimes people have the tendency to unwittingly shoot too many shots with really similar framing. So most videos like to alternate between a variety of different shots. So when you're editing a video, if you cut between two shots with kind of a medium framing, then it's going to look like a jump cut. So the way you so you want to alternate between different kinds of shots. So make sure you get a lot of wide shots, some medium shots, and some close shots. For your purposes, you also want to aim to have a relatively neutral angle in your photos. So if you're shooting a person, you want the angle to be at eye level. because if you shoot them from lower down, you'll be kind of, you'll make them look really big and imposing, or you'll be kind of shooting up their nose. So, and if you shoot them from them above, then you're kind of looking down on them at their forehead and their head more than their actual face. So neither of those is ideal. So this can be challenging if you're either a really tall or a really short person, which is why tripods are a huge help, because you can just adjust them to the height of the person in the video. So it isn't a hard and fast rule. There are definitely cases when you'll want to change the perspective, but it's important to make that decision intentionally. So of course you can do it more creatively. Just make sure it's really an intentional shot, and you have a reason for shooting it that way. It's often a little bit easier if it's a wider shot. You can make it a little bit more dramatic. Next thing you want to think about is stability and movement. So there are many different styles of shooting with various levels of stability. So you can shoot handheld, on a gimbal, or on a tripod. And the benefit of shooting handheld is that it doesn't require any equipment, but it does take some practice and can get tiring. So my tips to improve your stability are to have a wide stance, bend your knees slightly so you don't sway too much, and put your weight in your heels. And as for your arm stamina, just try and brace your elbows against your torso a little bit. So this will keep your arms more stable and also prevent them from tiring out. So if you're using a camera that has a strap, you can also use the strap as an additional anchor point to keep your camera steady. For your purposes, shooting with a gimbal would mostly be a smartphone or a DJI Pocket Go. And these kinds are not too difficult to pick up. You just need to kind of practice and get comfortable shooting like that. And moving on to tripods. So tripod shots will be perfectly stable unless there's a bunch of wind and you have a relatively light camera. In which case, you should know that almost all tripods have a hook right underneath where the camera goes. And so if wind is a problem, then you can hook a backpack or something heavy to keep it from falling over. So tripods are also helpful to keep your camera at eye level, as I mentioned before. So if you're really tall or really short, you can just put the camera on a tripod and you can put it at eye level with the person that you're filming. So with all this in mind, one of the biggest pitfalls of beginner videographers is not holding their shots long enough. And you'll know this if you ever try to edit with your own stuff, because you'll be watching your own footage and kicking yourself. So every little thing you did wrong that you wish you did better. So most of the shots you want to hold for around 8 seconds, and don't just count to 8. You want to count real seconds. So in your head, you want to say 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000, and count that way. And then if you're shooting some action, you want to keep recording throughout all of the action. So as things are moving, you might need to reframe your shot, and reframing is not a problem. But if you're just constantly reframing, then you're not going to have anything that's usable. So you kind of have to commit to a shot and just try to hold it for that 8 seconds and then move it, even if your framing isn't perfect. And in some action situations, if there's going to be a lot of movement, you might be better off just to have a wider shot, since it's easier to get the framing right that way. For those of you who are planning to shoot content for your own videos, you might want to interview a colleague on camera, or have a colleague interview you for your video. So I'm going to teach you the classic way to frame an interview so that it looks nice. So the background can either be really neutral so that you can focus on the face of the interviewee, or perhaps it's something relevant that they're talking about, or bookcases are a common choice, but preferably it's a quiet place with no echo. Next, you want to decide whether to have your interviewee seated or standing. Usually you want them to sit down because it's just more comfortable, and it'll be easier to keep them in focus since they won't be as tempted to move around. Now you want to figure out where your lighting source is, because you want to make sure your interview isn't backlit. So if you're outside, you want your interviewee to be looking in the direction of the sun, but preferably it's not directly in their face, otherwise they're going to be squinting. But then if it's indoors, just make sure it's a well-lit room, but not harsh overhead lighting. Then you'll want to follow the rule of thirds, having your subject placed off center, preferably lined up with one of the vertical lines, and then with looking space in the other direction, with their eyes lined up with the horizontal line. Okay, moving on from video. As scientists, I'm pretty sure you don't show up at your field sites with no planning and just expect to get everything done. So I'm proposing that you treat media production just like another one of your tasks that you have to do, and not an extra thing that you'll do if you have time, because I feel like a lot of people won't have time. So if you really bake it into your plan, I think it'll be really high impact. And this doesn't mean you have to do everything. I'm just saying focus on what you want to do and what's realistic, and make yourself a plan for success. So step one, so identify what outputs you want. Do you want to focus on traditional media, and all the extra stuff you're gathering is just the bare minimum to support that? Or do you want to create your own products? Will you be focusing more on photos or videos? Is someone writing a blog that they need photos for? Or will you be needing certain kinds of photos to support the papers that you're writing? Or will you need photos for a poster session? All of this you want to put into an extensive list of any outputs that you might want or need. And if it's too big of a list and it doesn't seem doable, then just narrow it down to the must-haves. And then you can even have some, maybe you have the must-haves and then you have some of the nice-to-haves if you have time. Another huge pitfall of media production is if you just say to the group, hey, everyone take some photos of the field work, then no one is going to know for sure that you've taken photos of all the important things. So this doesn't mean that a bunch of people can't be taking photos or videos, but just make sure that people know what they're responsible for capturing. So assign roles. So this is also useful to keep in mind, because chances are your fellow researchers might have some hidden talents. Maybe someone's really good at photography and another person loves social media and another one's an excellent writer. So if you kind of divvy up the tasks and have people focus on what they're good at or what they're excited about, then you know that the work is going to get done because you have someone who's responsible for it. So after you've determined your outputs and determined who's responsible for what tasks, you should make a shot list. And by this, I mean, go through all the steps in your research, everything from packing your equipment before you leave to getting on the plane or renting a car, jumping on the ferry, or like whatever transportation steps there are. And try and document the different steps or as many as you can. Then you're arriving at your field station, you're setting up, again, depending on your outputs you've decided on. This doesn't have to be a lot of shots, just one or two good ones of each step. Then all the different phases of your research to leaving at the end of the season. But also a lot of researchers forget to get shots of their living quarters, their meals. Sometimes it's nice to see the entire process, depending on what your output is. And then, of course, consider that you want a variety of shots, wides, mediums, and close-ups. And you want to make sure that you get portraits of each person on the team. So this can be useful for people's careers to have nice photos of them at work, and also just great for any press that you get. If someone's researching someone on, or someone is interviewing someone on your team, then and then that gets published, they'll want to publish a photo of them, and it's even better if it's one in the field. So it'll be up to you to how extensive you want your shot list to be. Maybe you make it very long so that it covers all your bases, but highlight a few really important things to get, and then you make sure the essentials are captured, and then everything else is just extra. Or maybe you want to just keep an essentials on the shot list. Keep it simple so it's not overwhelming. So that's up to you. But just make sure you have a bit of a plan of like, what do you need for your outputs? But please, I beg of you, please test your gear before you leave. So you wouldn't bring expensive specialized research gear into the field without testing it first. So don't do that with your camera gear. I can't tell you how many times people have done this. And besides, so I already told you, don't buy anything new just because you think you're going to start taking photos. So hopefully you're bringing in gear that you're already comfortable with. But just, make sure you have a checklist and you have everything you need. Don't forget your charger. Don't forget your extra batteries. Maybe you need a rain cover, all that stuff. Make sure you have all the accessories that you need. So I realize that fieldwork schedules can be jam-packed. So in order to make sure that media gets produced, I would recommend scheduling it in if it's realistic. Can you schedule in, say, 5 or 10 minutes for photos every day, or maybe every other day? Or maybe it's just, or maybe it's 10 minutes twice a day if you have a lot of, you think you'll have a lot of time. Whatever is reasonable for you it's going to depend on how many outputs you have and how involved they are, and also how jam-packed your schedule is otherwise. So just figure out what's realistic and try and schedule it in. If you plan to create outputs for social media, you'll know from my last presentation that consistency is key. So if you do one post on Instagram before your trip and then one post after and just call it a day, so that's a little bit of a wasted opportunity unless you're just posting for family or for personal reasons. But if you actually want to really work on gaining a following, you should make a schedule and try to stick with it. If you don't have internet access while you're out in the field and therefore can't post in real time, that's totally fine. You can still make a posting schedule for after you return. And those kind of campaigns can still be really effective. So perhaps you start posting day one you get back, you post the day that you got there. And then you just post one photo a day for the duration of your trip. And you can make nice captions, tell a bit of your story, just as long as you have a consistent schedule and keep constantly learning and improving. It can be very impactful. So focus on consistency. And finally, if you're going the traditional media route, it often makes sense to notify the media in advance and perhaps schedule some interviews from the field. Can you call them from a satellite phone? Like logistics of these kinds of things are much better to sort out before you leave if it's possible. So before we wrap up, I'd like to sum up everything that we've kind of talked about. So photography is the longest, so bear with me. So use the camera you have until you outgrow it. Follow the rule of thirds and enable a grid on your phone to make that easier. Keep your horizon straight. Avoid digital zoom and zoom with your feet if you don't have optical zoom. Understand how focal length will impact your shots by squishing things closer together the more you zoom in or stretching them out for wider angles. Use movement in your photos to your advantage by taking long exposure shots where some things are moving and some things are staying still. Simplify your photos, be a minimalist, add humans to your landscape shots, or don't, just be intentional. Remove awkward distractions, create depth in your photos, use leading lines, avoid backlighting in the middle of the day, and seek out backlighting at golden hour. Don't awkwardly cut off any limbs. Keep the limbs intact unless it's intentional. Have a diversity of different kinds of photos. And finally, write good captions. For the recording audio, remember to download a recording app and perhaps consider buying an external microphone. Use markers as you're recording, pay attention to audio levels, keep the correct distance from the microphone, build a blanket fort DIY recording studio if you're not on camera, pay attention to distracting sounds and avoid them as much as possible, record a few seconds of room tone for editing later on. And I'm not going to recap the interviewing tips because it's hard to say them in short, concise ways. But finally, time to recap the videos. So have a plan and know what you want to get. But sometimes exciting things come up, record it. Record good audio. It can be more important than video. Decide whether you want to shoot handheld with a gimbal or with a tripod and try to be consistent. Try to shoot in a neutral perspective, not looking down on people and not looking up people's noses. Hold your shot or your framing for around 8 seconds and get a variety of shots, wide, medium, and close. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this useful. Sabrina, were there any questions?
Yes, indeed, there were. The first was actually a comment, just that smartphones are hard to use with gloves on in the polar regions, just a point. But the first question was, which apps for audio recording would you recommend? Yeah, I think you mentioned some, but if you could mention.
Yeah, well, personally, I use Meta Recorder, but I think there's I haven't really used the other ones, but I think they're all pretty similar.
Mm-hmm. Is there a particular reason that you don't recommend using actual video cameras for taking video?
Well, I mean, I think if you're a professional, of course you'd want to use proper video cameras. But I just am kind of making this for researchers who are probably out in the field and maybe like this isn't their main job. Like this is just kind of an extra thing, because video cameras, proper ones, can be very expensive. And I find like the cheapest, like more kind of professional thing would be like, like the DSLRs, and then you add in the audio, and then that can be a pretty good, you can get pretty good content from that. But yeah, like once you get into the like the Canon C100s and like the like Blackmagic Pocket Cinema, like all these like cinema cameras, they're so expensive and they're just bulky, and I don't think it's very practical for researchers. But if that's your thing, like if you really want to take good videos and you're really keen and you know how to use it, then like that's amazing, and you absolutely should do that.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Olivia, can I ask you to stop sharing a screen so we can see you a little better?
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for reminding me.
Okay, next question. I recently learned that portrait shots are more used today than landscape because of the smartphone usage, where people look at things in portrait mode. What's your take on this, and would you do a video in portrait mode?
Yes. So my take on this is, if you're taking videos that are going to be edited into something that's going to be shared on Vimeo or YouTube, usually you would do it in landscape mode. But I actually alternate. Like when I'm taking videos of just in my everyday life, I will take some in landscape and some in portrait, because it is true. Like there's just so much sharing on social media. Like if you're creating an Instagram reel, if you're creating like a TikTok video, all of that is in portrait orientation. And yeah, so it's becoming a pretty big thing. So I would say, like generally, like if you're not like me and you're taking videos for many different uses, like kind of identify what's your main use. Are you going to be mainly posting on social media, or are you going to be mainly editing stuff for YouTube or sending it to a journalist who's going to maybe put it in a film that they're making, and just decide what's more practical for you to shoot in portrait or landscape orientation.
Yeah, thanks very much. Final answer is, aside from all the info, or it's final question rather, aside from all the info you shared, is there any relevant tip to include using drones for photos and videos?
I love drones. Yeah, well, I mean, I would say, yeah, if you have a drone, if you have the budget, if you have the space, take one, 100%. You know, DJI, Mavics, Mavic Air, Mavic Mini, like they're getting so small and so powerful. So yeah, if you can, definitely bring a drone on your field work. And so I guess my biggest suggestion there would be like in terms of actually shooting with the drone. I mean, first of all, make sure you're legal, make sure you have your license, and it's really, like, at least in Norway, it's really not that hard. You know, it just takes a few hours of studying, and then there's a test. And I think it's pretty similar in the rest of Europe. So make sure you have your license, and then make sure you can download this app. What's it called? Air Map, I think. Here, let me just pull it up. Yeah, it's called Air Map, and you can see in the app the airspace regulation of the area that you're currently in. So it'll use GPS to see where you are, and it'll show you, like, if you can legally fly. Like, so you can see if there's any airports nearby. If you're in a national park, so national parks, again, like they will have some rules, some special rules usually, and you have to get permission to fly there. So yeah, it's depends on where you are. If you're super remote, chances are it's probably totally fine for you to fly. And if you're in a protected area, chances are you know all of the people to get the permits from, because you're working with them for your actual field work. So yeah, just make sure everything's legal, everything's good. Then when you want to take your drone up, just try and be as cinematic as possible. Just don't make jerky movements. So, you know, try and get the slow pan, you know, try and get the flyover shot. So you have your camp or wherever you're doing your field work underneath you, and you get like kind of a flyover, and then like maybe a reveal, have the camera pan up so then you can see like the whole landscape. Just trying to think of like a videographer. I think another tip that I would give is anyone who really wants to get into video, just watch a lot of videos and just get inspired. Find stuff that's like a little bit similar to what you would want to do, and just watch a lot of content, and really analyze what you're watching, and like think about how they did it, and why they did it, and why they chose to put this shot there, and then it'll really improve your work.
There's one more question. Instagram Reels or TikTok are pretty short-lived media which still require a lot of work. Is it still valuable in science communication?
Yeah, that's really going to depend. Yeah, so personally, I've kind of looked at TikTok science stuff, like the kind of like the science content that gets posted on TikTok, and like I feel like you're not really gonna be able to teach a lot of like actual kind of like hard science concepts. Like I don't think that that's the goal of TikTok. But I think one of the benefits of it is you're really reaching a younger audience, and you're making them like feel like science is more accessible, you know. So I think there are benefits. But yeah, you know, if it's something that you hate and you don't enjoy it, like don't do it. You know, if you're excited about it and you kind of enjoy TikTok and you use it, then maybe it's a good use of your time. But if it's just like, if you're just like, oh, this feels so dumb, don't do it. Don't force yourself, because yeah, like there is something to be said. Like there's so many different ways that you can communicate science, and if TikTok is not inspiring you, like don't use it. Instagram Reels, yeah, it's like, it's kind of hard because you know, the Reels is a new it's a newer thing that Instagram is pushing, and so we're like, okay, how long is this really going to last? But you know, if you want to make it big on Instagram right now, you really have to use Reels, because the algorithm is pushing Reels and not photos. And that's really just in response to TikTok, because TikTok is so popular. So, you know, if your goal is, you're like, okay, I love Instagram, I want to have a successful Instagram account, like you kind of have to make the Reels. But again, yeah, it's a lot of work. So if you don't like it, if you don't enjoy the work, then focus on something else that you do enjoy. I think that's my biggest advice. Because yeah, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, that's a good tip. Thanks, Olivia. Any other questions while we have Olivia here? You can ask live.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, I want to thank Olivia. Thank you so much for sharing all your experiences and insights. And I think it was a really concise training that we got. And I think sometimes, or would assume that there are maybe just small adjustments needed to to improve own media products. And yeah, I think, or I hope that we could motivate you for your next field work, and that you are looking forward collecting media products and telling your story from the field. We would be excited to see that. And
yeah, tag me in your Instagram posts.
Yeah. Yeah, in the next few months, we will also again offer some seminars in the frame of the Arctic Passion online seminar series. So also watch out for that. And yeah, we'll definitely share the information via the Apex and Arctic Passion channels. And thank you all for listening and taking time for this webinar, or this two-parted mini series of science communication. And yeah, we wish you a good continuation of the day. Take care, everybody, and see you perhaps soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.